We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
Early that morning, investigators received a call that quietly shifted the direction of the case. It wasn't a discovery. It wasn't a confession. It was something much smaller than that. A detail. But according to investigators, that detail did not match what they believed about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. And once they began looking closer, that mismatch started to point in a direction they hadn't fully considered before. Because until that moment, the timeline, while incomplete, at least followed a pattern that made sense. Now, it didn't. And at the center of that shift was Tommaso. Everything in this case, based on available information, begins with a routine that didn't happen. Nancy Guthrie was known to follow a consistent schedule. Family members described her as structured, predictable, the kind of person who didn't simply disappear without explanation. So, when she failed to show up where she was expected reportedly for a routine commitment, it raised concern almost immediately. At first, investigators approached it as they would any missing person case. They looked at her last known movements. They spoke to people closest to her. They tried to establish a clear timeline. And for a short period of time, that timeline appeared stable. But that didn't last. Because one of the earliest pieces of evidence recovered from her home began to introduce a problem. According to investigators, forensic teams identified biological material inside the residence that did not immediately match Nancy or anyone known to be closely associated with her. At first, it was logged as routine, something to be processed, categorized, and possibly ruled out. But that changed, because the location of that evidence didn't fully align with what investigators believed about Nancy's final movements inside the house. And that raises a question. If the evidence doesn't belong to Nancy and doesn't match anyone expected to be there, then how did it get inside the home? Now, here's what matters. At this stage, investigators were not working with conclusions. They were working with possibilities. And one of those possibilities involved access. Who had access to the house? Who could move through it without raising suspicion? Who could be present without it appearing unusual? That's where Tommaso enters the timeline. As Nancy's son-in-law, he was not an outsider. He was someone who, according to available information, had a reason to be around the property, which meant investigators couldn't immediately dismiss his presence as suspicious. But they also couldn't ignore it. Because when they began reconstructing movements around the time Nancy was last seen, certain gaps started to appear. And those gaps didn't just involve Nancy. They involved Tommaso too. This is where things begin to change. Initially, his role in the investigation appeared limited. He was part of the extended family circle, someone who would naturally be spoken to but not necessarily focused on. But according to investigators, that changed as more information came in. Because when they began comparing statements with physical evidence, small inconsistencies started to surface. Not dramatic ones, not obvious contradictions, but enough to raise questions. And in an investigation like this, questions matter. Think about this. When someone disappears, investigators rely heavily on consistency. Does the timeline match? Do statements align with known movements? Do details reinforce each other? In this case, one detail reportedly did not. And it wasn't immediately clear why. Because on the surface, everything appeared normal. There were no signs of forced entry. No immediate indication of a struggle. Nothing that clearly explained how Nancy could vanish from a space she was familiar with. But the presence of unidentified forensic evidence suggested something else. Something that didn't belong. And that brings us back to Tommaso. According to investigators, his proximity to Nancy's daily life meant that any shift in routine would likely involve him in some way. Not necessarily as a suspect, but as someone who could provide clarity. Except, clarity didn't come as easily as expected. Because when timelines were compared, there were moments that didn't fully align. Moments where investigators reportedly had to pause and ask a simple question. Does this match what we know? And in at least one instance, the answer appeared to be no. Now at this point, investigators believed they understood the structure of the case, but that changed. because new information began to challenge the idea that Nancy's disappearance followed a predictable sequence. Instead, it started to look like something else, something less visible, something that didn't leave obvious traces. And that's where the forensic detail becomes important again, because it wasn't just the presence of the evidence that mattered. It was where it was found. According to available information, its location inside the home raised a contradiction between what investigators believed happened and what the physical evidence suggested. And when physical evidence contradicts a timeline, one of them has to be wrong. So investigators began to re-examine everything. The sequence of events, the statements given, the movements around the house, and more importantly, the interactions between Nancy and the people closest to her. Because in cases like this, the answers are rarely found in one single moment. They're found in the connections between moments. And one of those connections appeared to lead back to Tommaso. But that wasn't the part that concerned investigators the most. What concerned them was the possibility that the timeline itself had been misunderstood. Because if Nancy's final movements were not what they initially believed, then everything built on that timeline becomes uncertain. And that includes who was where and when. This is where things shift again, because linking someone to a case does not mean proving what happened. It simply means that the available information places them closer to the unanswered questions. And in this case, those questions are still very much unresolved. According to investigators, they are working to understand how all these elements fit together. The forensic evidence, the timeline gaps, the behavioral patterns, and the relationships involved. But even with all of that, one issue remains. If the evidence inside Nancy's home does not match her, and does not clearly match anyone expected to be there, then someone else was present, or something happened that has not yet been fully explained. And if Tommaso is now being linked more closely to the timeline, then the question is no longer just about where Nancy went. It becomes something more specific, something more difficult to answer. Because if the timeline doesn't fully align, and the evidence doesn't fully match, then one question remains. What actually happened inside that house during the period no one can fully account for? By the time investigators began taking a closer look at the timeline, they were no longer treating Nancy Guthrie's disappearance as a simple missing person case. Something had shifted. Not because of a single piece of evidence, but because the pieces they already had were no longer fitting together the way they should. And when that happens, according to investigators, the next step is not to add more information. It's to go back and question what you thought you already understood. At this point, the focus turned to reconstruction. Not just where Nancy had been, but how her final known movements were being interpreted. Because up until then, the timeline relied heavily on routine. What Nancy usually did, where she was expected to be, who she typically interacted with. But routines can be misleading, especially when something interrupts them. And according to available information, there were signs that something may have interrupted Nancy's routine earlier than initially believed. Now here's what matters. When investigators re-examined activity inside the home, they began to notice something subtle, a sequence that appeared slightly out of order. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest that the timeline might not have been linear. And if the timeline isn't linear, then the assumptions built around it start to weaken, because it means that what was believed to have happened before may have actually occurred after, and that changes everything. This is where Tommaso becomes more central to the investigation, not because of a direct accusation, but because of proximity and timing. According to investigators, his movements during the critical window began to receive more attention, not just where he said he was, but how those movements aligned with everything else. Because alignment is what gives a timeline strength. And in this case, alignment was becoming harder to establish. Think about this. If someone is present during a key period of time, investigators expect their account to match the physical environment. Doors, lighting, objects, even small details like the position of items in a room. And in this case, one detail reportedly stood out. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something that would immediately draw attention, but it didn't fully match the description that had been given. And that created a gap, a small one, but enough to matter, because once a gap appears, investigators begin to test it. They revisit statements. They compare versions. They look for consistency over time. And according to available information, that process began to reveal something else. Not a direct contradiction, but a shift in emphasis. Details that were once clearly described became less specific. Moments that were once confidently recalled became less certain. And that raises a different kind of question. Not what happened, but why is this becoming harder to explain? Now, at this point, investigators believed they were narrowing the possibilities. But that changed. Because the forensic evidence, the same evidence that had raised questions from the beginning, started to play a more active role in the investigation. It was no longer just something to be identified. It became something to be interpreted. According to investigators, the location of that evidence inside the home suggested movement. Not random movement, directed movement. The kind that implies someone was present in a way that doesn't align with normal activity. And when that interpretation was placed alongside the timeline, it didn't fit. Because based on what was known, there shouldn't have been unexplained movement in that part of the house. Not at that time. Not under those conditions. And yet, the evidence suggested otherwise. So investigators began asking a more focused question. If someone was moving through the house in a way that doesn't match the expected timeline, who was it? And when did that movement occur? This is where behavioral analysis enters the picture. Because when physical evidence and timelines begin to conflict, investigators look at patterns. Not just what people say, but how they say it, how they respond to questions, what they emphasize, and what they avoid. And according to available information, Tommaso's interactions during this phase of the investigation were closely observed. Not because he had been identified as responsible, but because his position in the timeline made his perspective important. At first, his responses appeared consistent, measured, calm. The kind of responses you would expect from someone trying to help clarify a situation. But as questions became more specific, something subtle began to change. Not in what he said, but in how those answers connected. Think about that. It's not always the answer itself that raises concern. Sometimes, it's how that answer fits into everything else. And in this case, according to investigators, certain answers didn't fully connect. They stood on their own. But when placed into the broader timeline, they left space. Unexplained space. And that space matters. Because in an investigation like this, unexplained space often points to something missing. A detail, a moment, an action that hasn't been fully accounted for. This is where things begin to tighten. Because as investigators worked through these gaps, they started to focus on a narrower window of time. A period that, based on available information, could not be clearly reconstructed. Not from physical evidence. Not from statements. Not from routine patterns. And that window is where the central question becomes more precise. Because it's no longer just about Nancy's disappearance. It's about what happened during that specific period. A period where movement is suggested, but not fully explained. A period where presence is implied, but not clearly confirmed. Now here's where the contradiction becomes harder to ignore. If the forensic evidence suggests someone was in a specific area of the home, and the timeline does not clearly place anyone there, then either the timeline is incomplete, or someone's account is. And according to investigators, that is exactly what they are working to determine. Now at this point, investigators believed they were getting closer to understanding the sequence of events. But that changed. Because as they revisited earlier assumptions, another detail began to surface. A detail that had been present from the beginning, but not fully understood. It involved access. Not just who could enter the home, but who could move through it without creating suspicion. Because there is a difference. And that difference matters. According to available information, Tommaso's familiarity with the environment placed him in a unique position. He knew the layout. He understood the routine. He would not immediately stand out. And that makes his role in the timeline more complex. Not definitive, but more difficult to separate from the unanswered questions. But even with that, one issue still remains unresolved. Because no matter how the timeline is adjusted, and no matter how the statements are interpreted, the forensic evidence still needs an explanation. If it does not belong to Nancy, and if it does not clearly belong to someone expected to be there, then it points to a presence that has not been fully identified. And if that presence existed during the same window of time where the timeline becomes unclear, then everything begins to converge on a single unresolved point. Because if Tommaso is now being more closely linked to that window, not by conclusion, but by proximity and inconsistency, then one question becomes unavoidable. Was he simply part of an incomplete timeline? Or does that unexplained window point to something that has not yet been fully revealed? By the time investigators reached this stage, the case no longer revolved around whether something had happened inside the house. That part was no longer in question. What remained unclear was how it happened, and more importantly, who was present when it did. Because at this point, three things were now sitting side by side: the timeline, the forensic evidence, and the statements given. And according to investigators, those three elements were not aligning the way they should. So they went back again, not to find something new, but to remove what didn't belong. Now here's what matters. When investigators begin eliminating possibilities, the case doesn't get bigger. It gets smaller, more focused, more precise. And in this case, that process began to narrow the number of viable explanations. First, they looked at forced entry. There was no clear indication that someone had broken into the home. No damage, no obvious signs of intrusion. That possibility began to fade. Then they examined routine disruption. Had Nancy left voluntarily? Had something pulled her away unexpectedly? But according to available information, there was no clear evidence supporting that either. Her routine didn't suggest preparation. There were no confirmed sightings placing her elsewhere. That explanation became harder to support, which left something else, something internal, something that occurred within the space itself. This is where the earlier contradictions begin to converge. Because the forensic evidence still had not been fully explained, and the timeline still contained a gap. And according to investigators, both of those elements pointed toward the same window of time, a window that could not be clearly accounted for. Now at this point, investigators believed they had reduced the case to a manageable set of possibilities, but that changed, because one final layer began to take shape. It involved behavior over time. Not just during the initial investigation, but after. According to available information, investigators began to observe how individuals connected to the case responded as new details emerged. Because in many investigations, behavior doesn't stay constant. It adapts. Sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that only become noticeable when compared over time. And in this case, those observations reportedly added another layer to the analysis. Not conclusions, not accusations, but patterns. Think about this. When someone is recalling events accurately, their account may vary in detail, but the structure remains stable. The order, the relationships between moments, the logic of what happened. But when something is uncertain or incomplete, that structure can begin to shift. According to investigators, there were moments where that structure appeared to shift. Again, not dramatically, but enough to raise a question. And that question wasn't just about what was said. It was about what was missing. Because as the investigation continued, certain details that would normally be expected were not clearly accounted for. Movements, transitions, explanations that should connect one moment to another. And when those connections are missing, investigators don't fill them in. They leave them open. Because those gaps often lead somewhere. Now here's where everything begins to come together. The forensic evidence suggests that someone was present in a way that doesn't match the known timeline. The timeline suggests that there is a period that cannot be fully reconstructed, and the behavioral analysis suggests that certain details surrounding that period are not clearly defined. Individually, each of those elements raises a question, but together, they begin to point in a direction. Not a conclusion, but a direction. And according to investigators, that direction brings the focus back to Tommaso, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of how multiple elements intersect around him: his proximity to the environment, his position within the timeline, and the moments where clarity becomes less certain. But that still isn't the final piece, because even with all of this, one issue remains unresolved: the origin of the forensic evidence. If that evidence can be definitively identified, then it may confirm whether an unknown individual was present, or whether the timeline itself has been misunderstood. And that distinction matters, because it changes the entire structure of the case. Now at this point, investigators believe they were close to understanding what happened, but that changed, because one final contradiction remained. If someone was present inside the house during that critical window, and if that presence is connected to the unexplained evidence, then there should be a clear point of entry, or interaction, or movement that explains it. But according to available information, that clarity has not yet been fully established, which brings everything back to the same unresolved moment, the same gap, the same unanswered question that has been sitting at the center of this case from the beginning. Because if the timeline cannot fully account for who was inside that house, and if the evidence cannot yet fully identify that presence, then the investigation is still missing something. Something that connects those two elements. And until that connection is made, one question remains. Was Tommaso simply closest to the uncertainty, or is he the missing link that explains what actually happened inside that house?